two arguments. The first is about why this shift is done for the benefit of citizens, and second of all, about how these alliances are more durable. Firstly, on setup, what we think this looks like is a shift because countries have realised that previous alliances are counterproductive to their citizens or are not as advantageous as they possibly could be. This shift has occurred gradually, and we support it occurring gradually, which means that you can still do things like offer degrees of support and solidarity to those that have a similar cultural identity to you, but you are more active in forging new alliances. We think this looks like Arab states normalising relationships with Israel. It looks like Anglophone countries shifting to Asia. For example, places like India and Japan, like Australia, forging ties with them rather than other Anglophone countries. It looks like Spanish colonies forging relationships with Asian nations rather than other Anglophone countries. Firstly, let's explain why this is done for the direct benefit of citizens, and therefore why we just all support it, noting that this calculus is made in a way that is rational for a few reasons and a few benefits. Four things notably. Firstly, often it is done directly to advance the safety of countries. That looks like things like having better military-to-military communication. Looks like things like reducing potential accidents in your region. Looks like things like cooperating on issues of, for example, counter-terrorism, issues of intelligence sharing, issues of arms trading. And it looks like things like when you're fighting a civil war, it is just helpful to be able to access all of those benefits in that you're able to get more direct benefits from alliances that are less cultural and more economically advantageous. Which is the second benefit, which is that you are able to claim a huge amount of economic and trade benefits when you associate with countries that are not culturally significant to you, but just like geopolitically or geographically more helpful to you. First of all, note that to have significant amounts of cooperation, you need to have a requisite level of trust and oversight. And that should make you believe that the calculus that these countries make is relatively rational, and that they understand, and they would only opt into forging those relationships at the point where that trust is developed. Because you need to do things like have free trade deals. For example, when you're organising things like assurances of infrastructure, you necessarily need to have a level of trust with that country that you're doing a deal with. But also, it just takes a huge amount of time to forge these bonds. So we know the fact that alliances only develop and get stronger at the point where that prerequisite level of trust is there. The third benefit that they realise is good is access to for example, to diplomatic and international support. That looks like things like getting benefits of natural disaster relief from a country that is more economically advantageous to you. Looks like being able to get the infrastructure and resources and personnel and volunteers on the ground from a place that may not be culturally similar to you, but just is able to benefit you in that way. For example, like aligning yourself with China, even if that's not culturally beneficial to you, because you're able to benefit from things like the BRI. It looks like, for example, aligning yourself with Israel as an Arab state when you're able to get more aid from them. But the fourth reason we would posit as to why this is a benefit is because you now are able to access a far larger amount of choice. Because know the fact that if you are a country that exists in a cultural minority, there are only a small number of states that may have that cultural similarity to you, and often those states are not particularly powerful ones. So it is just far preferable to align yourself with something that is more economically advantageous, more geopolitically connected, has more of a voice, for example, in Bretton Woods institutions, than countries that, whilst might have a similar cultural alliance to you, aren't actually able to represent you and help you on the global stage as well. Second of all, why do we think that this trade-off is done in a rational way and in a useful way? I think there are three things to note here. Firstly, note the fact that a lot of the places that we're talking about that are shifting from cultural alliances to non-cultural alliances are post-colonial states. And what that should make you believe is that even though they have the colonial history and the scars of colonialism burnt in their mind, they are still forging these bonds despite that. And that should make you believe that they are still shifting to choose away from these countries, despite the fact that they could give them some sort of cultural solidarity. That should make you believe that the risk calculus of the benefit of economic growth to them is more worthwhile than that cultural alliance. The second thing we'd note, though, is that when you change your foreign relationships, there is just a huge amount of domestic backlash, but still these countries choose to shift to them because they have a real preference, because they are able to benefit more economically. Thirdly, though, piece of mitigation is that obviously these countries can still support others with the same identity, because you can still have some level of solidarity with geopolitical alliances. We think this looks like things like Jordyn still being an ally to Palestine in the way that it is a diplomatic mediator, in the way that it still provides them with aid, and in the way that it still accepts refugees, even if that relationship isn't as strong as it once was. Right. So that should make you believe that when things get the absolute worst, they are still able to step in. But during normal times, and in times when your own country is at risk, it is just far better to have that economic advantage on the table. That is something that is weighed extremely highly in the debate. What is the weighing at the end of this argument? One, these countries are rational actors and they are opting in for the benefit of their own constituents. When you are able to help people economically on the ground more, by having an ally that is far more powerful, that is useful. And we are willing to trade off that cultural solidarity in that we think there are other ways that we're able to access cultural solidarity. Things like information sharing, things like having a diverse population, other ways in which durable. Why do we think this alliance is far more durable? And note this actually, yeah, Jordyn, sure.
Do you think that NATO is a cultural alliance?
Yes? No, probably not. Deal with that. Let's talk about the durability of alliances, because I'm guessing that opposition is going to be like, well, culture binds you in a way that economic and political ties are never able to. I think there are two responses to this. The first is there are obviously other ways you can forge ties, things like military, like things like having military communication, but we also note that economic growth as an alliance increasing is something that brings you a huge amount of durability. And note the fact that what this also does is it counteracts the narrative that you can only have an alliance with those that are homogeneously similar to you. And what that means is that it means that one, you're able to appreciate other cultures better, but two, it just means that you have less on-net homogeneous relationships. This is a trend that we support by virtue of the fact that the widespread impacts of it have meant that countries have developed in a way that is one, less homogeneous, two, less prescriptive to, for example, only organizations with countries that have similar cultural and religious ideologies to you, and that on net means the level of information sharing you get, the diversity of policy you get, and the economic benefits that you get are incredibly massive. So, what is the contribution from OG at the end of the round? First of all, this is beneficial for citizens on the ground. Second of all, it is useful for things like peacekeeping, it's useful for things like economic growth. But thirdly, the diversity of policy that you're able to attain on side government is just far better. So even if we have to trade off some levels of cultural solidarity, you all believe that you can access that cultural solidarity in other ways. It is unclear why this is the exclusive claim that you're able to get, the exclusive way that you're able to get it, vote opening government.
Is NATO a cultural alliance? I actually don't know what the answer is. I think it's pretty fair that Bella doesn't either, because the answer is not clear. And what is important about that is to understand that often what this debate is about is it is actually about the framing of an alliance. It's about the understanding of what its purpose is. It's about the way that it's described and rationalized and marketed, because it's not clear in many instances where culture begins and ends. So it is about thinking, when I describe this alliance and when I think about whether we should enter into it, how is that rationale framed? So NATO, for instance, you could say it is a cultural alliance. You could say it's an alliance founded on shared values around freedom, around capitalism, around free trade, around liberalism. Or you could say, actually, it's a very realpolitik alliance, and it's basically just about balancing against once Russia and now more about China. And I think that what is important in this debate is to understand that what we support here is we support continuing to use those cultural foundations, that idea that there are cultural commonalities, and that that is an important component of why you should form a relationship and how you market that relationship and alliance on our side. And I think the counterfactual and the types of things that GovSci describes are probably things more like more hard and bare bones types of alliances. So stuff like the CPTPP thing, for example. Sorry if I've gotten those letters the wrong way around. But that was not something that was ever, like, there was no cultural component to that. That was always just about free trade, economic growth, and so on. It's very cold and very bare bones. That's something that we don't support on our side. We support maybe that almost exact makeup of countries entering into alliance. But when they do so, that they do it as that they market it and understand it and describe it as being also about recognizing cultural commonalities that exist across those countries, and that being part of the rationale for why you do it and why you care about it. Why is this important in the debate? A few things. The first thing to say here is that no team should possibly be able to prove that one of these things necessarily means a change. Like it's a decline of X, not a prefer X to Y. And what you should believe is that alliances are not some sort of scarce resource, but if you choose to enter into one, that precludes you from others. And that means that this side doesn't get to prove that, well, it's good that we're declining cultural alliances, because now we get better kinds of alliances instead. That does not necessarily follow. They'll need to prove that that occurs. But also, if those other alliances that Bella describes are as good as she says they are, and we say they probably are in many respects, then there's no reason why you couldn't also enter into them. We just don't want cultural alliances to also decline alongside that. But we're happy, of course, to enter into many other types of alliances as they make sense, if they're economically sensible as well.
Point.
The second, yeah, go on.
At the height of the Cold War, do you think we could have just entered into alliances with the East and the West at the same time?
Well, that'd be a bit silly, wouldn't it? Like, we're not in the Cold War anymore, so I think that's quite a good thing for us. Whether it's like cultural, like they're just not as polarized in the way that they were, but also even to the extent that there are distinct blocks, that's often economic, that's also military, that's also, it's like, there's a bunch of other things as well that separate those blocks. So it's like, yeah, we wouldn't enter into a joint East-West alliance during the Cold War. You guys wouldn't be able to do that either because it doesn't make any sense. But also similarly, like on both sides of the house, you probably still have to choose between China and the US to a degree if you're in an Asian country, that kind of thing. So I'm not too sure where that's going, but it's pretty intriguing. The second thing to say here, though, is that entering into more alliances and more culturally based and understood alliances actually enhances your ability to enter into other types of alliances as well, because it integrates the norms of alliance making and partnership making, and it also promotes the idea that there are cultural similarities across different countries. That is extremely important because it makes the populations in those countries more used to the idea of partnering with other states and trusting them, more used to the idea of seeing cultural commonality if you're an Indonesian and a Malaysian when you otherwise might not have that view. And that is a good thing because it means then that these populations and countries and governments and the civil services that are all part of this process become far more used to seeking out that commonality and recognizing it as important, which makes them more attractive alliance partners and better at making those alliances as well. The second thing to talk about is how these alliances, I think, grow into the future and what changes about them. Because I would point towards things like NATO, I'd point towards things like the EU, I'd point towards ASEAN to an extent as well. And those things are important because they do promote that transnational understanding of cultural identity themselves. These alliances are themselves often institutions that have staff, that carry out functions, that do conferences, that do a variety of cross-governmental relations things. Like ASEAN, for instance, hosts a regular forum on farming in the region, and that's something that Australia attends and watches. This is incredibly important because the staff of these alliances that make up the institutions also are likely to be expansionist in their views around cultural commonality to promote that view, which means that they're more likely when they interact with other types of alliances to be primed to see those commonalities, to care about those people, to be more empathetic. And I think that that is an important thing to have integrated into these institutions. It makes them more compassionate, and it also means that the staff of those alliances are more likely to care about their own country's actions and to take a view on that, to care about cultural promotion and preservation, incredibly important. What you should, I think, understand is that often to elites and to the people who make decisions, culture isn't very important to them in a real sense because their culture is secure, it's often the dominant one, but also they have a variety of non-cultural benefits in their life, like having lots of money and power, for instance. Culture is most important to the people who often don't have very much power, who take satisfaction in practicing their culture, their religion, who care about it as being a key part of their identity because they have little in terms of material other things. And that's why culture often isn't adequately considered by these alliances. It's not something that's factored in when they think about what are the types of trade that we welcome, what are the types of trade that we restrict, what types of tourism do we want to encourage, and what should we want to restrict, where should the tourists go, what types of areas do we want to promote them. And I think these more culturally based alliances are ones that manage those agreements with a far greater mind towards that cultural preservation, far greater sensitivity to the people on the ground, which is why they're far more durable, politically popular, and more likely to last into the future and be accepted by the domestic populations who care greatly about these things, care greatly about culture. What does that mean then? It means that often these alliances are more human, it means that they're often more likely to do things in a way that is consensual, and I think it also means that the parties enter into them with a clear idea of their purpose, because they come in with a far greater and more positive mindset. They understand the commonality in their culture to the cultures of many others. I think it's a positive thing when we talk about NATO and think about its importance in the world, that means, I think, at times acknowledging that there's something important and similar between an American and a Polish person, and that is a degree of appreciation for freedom and a degree of appreciation for human rights. That is clearly a positive thing. Last thing then, how do these alliances interact with one another and other types of alliances? I think firstly, there's no real reason to think that they'd be provocative, militaristic, or competitive in this debate. That's not given by opening opposition or by opening government, and it wouldn't make sense. But we say that they're more likely to be collaborative because of all the analysis that I've given on the institutions and culture and beliefs of these alliances, of the people and the staff who engage with them and represent their governments within them, all being more likely to focus on finding those commonalities and caring about them. But we also think that every time one of these alliances is formed or promoted or deepened or expanded, that is important. It does send a meaningful message across the globe of different types of cultures and the things that you promote. When NATO expands, it demonstrates the success of freedom, the success of human rights. When ASEAN expands, it demonstrates the success of non-interference. And that's a good thing as well, because it promotes discussion, it promotes understandings. I think it makes people more cosmopolitan, happier, and more inclined to care about these things, which they should. Proud to oppose.
3 contributions from closing government. First, how this creates competition to provide better deals. Secondly, how this aids in the concentration of wealth and keeping it out of the hands of people who need it. Finally, why post-colonial deals are uniquely bad and oppressive in a handful of other ways. I want to start with opening opposition's definitional quibble, because they're like, this is just about framing, doesn't change the set of alliances. 3 reasons this isn't true. My first observation is that OG's reading of it, which is that it's about the decline of an actual form of alliance, is perfectly legitimate. OO's version is not to show their definition is more correct. Their definition is to show that OG's is so insane that it constitutes an unreasonable definition and needs to be replaced. It's certainly not so insane that it makes that far. OG's definition stands. Secondly, I'll note this is an empirical trend. Like, this is happening, that we're getting actual alliances not happening in the way that they are along the cultural lines increasingly. And finally, obviously, what we understand to be a good alliance impacts what forms of alliances we enter into, because countries and domestic populations make decisions about what alliances to enter into based on what they think makes an important alliance. All politics is local. You sign those deals because it's what your population wants. That, I think, fixes the definitional quibble and pretty well removes opening opposition from the debate.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
So, when your alliance is based on things like concrete mutual benefits, why would you maintain it when a partner goes through something like an economic recession? Whereas culture is something that always exists and a benefit that passes through this.
So the reason you would is because countries are very interested in being seen to be a stable partner, because otherwise people won't sign deals with them into the future. First extension, why this leads to more competition. The first thing I want to analyse here is why you want alliances, right? So, there's a bunch of reasons why you want to be able to get a large number of alliances. First, I know the empirical review of preference of states to continue to seek out alliances. Secondly, there's a series of economic benefits, alliances and geopolitical alliances, including in things like trade deals and economic integration. And third, there's a series of security benefits. But under our side, where they're not based on culture, you're more likely to work harder to get more of those alliances because there's now better market competition for who you ally with. Why is that true? First, because you're under their side, the people you are currently having alliances with are less likely to leave, even if you provide a suboptimal deal for them, for the reason that they consider the cultural alliance that you have to be sufficient reason to do it, even if it is suboptimal in other ways. And the outcome of that is that you don't need to work as hard to keep them around for the reason that they're going to stay around for that rational reason of culture. But secondly, there's also not as much of an incentive to go out and try and get deals with other people who aren't currently aligned with you, because you know that even if you make the deal better, they're not going to do it because they perceive the fact that they should do a cultural alliance with a different country, even if it is suboptimal. Opening opposition is a preemptive response to this. They say there's no trade-off between series of alliances. 4 reasons why this is true. First, the empirical existence of blocks that we've seen. For instance, I think OG talks about the Middle East. We could also point to China and the US. We could also point to the Cold War. Suggests that there is a trade-off here. And clearly the assertion from opening opposition that all conflict is over ever and we're not going to have any more polarization is untrue. Secondly, often in alliances you have to provide preferential treatment and make that country your first preference. You cannot have 2 countries being your first preference. Thirdly, often having an alliance requires you to take stands on things. For instance, you're required to take a stand on China's ownership in the South China Sea. And if that's true, then obviously you can't similarly take a stand for 2 countries who might require you to take mutually exclusive stances. And third, I'll note that these countries often have a substantial amount of conflict with each other, so don't want you to be allied with both of them, because it is a benefit to them if they can lock you into that deal and harm the country with which they are involved in conflict. So, how do you make your deal better? It means that you give better conditions. It means you give better terms. You're more likely to give them equal access to your market as you get access to their market. You're more likely to include provisions that prevent you from dumping into their economy. We're the team that makes these alliances better. How does this weigh over opening government? Because they explain that this is allocated incorrectly. That's true, but what we explain is not that you can better select the alliances, but that all of the alliances get better. Because it's better when China and the US have to compete and then they provide on-net better deals, which is more important than just allocating, because they allocate to a static series of deals. We explain how all of the deals get better. Second extension, how this stops the concentration of wealth in the wealthy parts of the world. Essentially what this extension will explain is people of European descent hold the vast majority of the wealth in the world, and this trend meant that they concentrated to a lesser degree. Because when you make alliances based on your cultural similarity, you're more likely to make alliances with countries that also are European, and that has massively contributed to the fact that white people of European descent continue to hold the vast majority of the wealth in the world. Why is it that people of European descent hold the vast majority of the wealth in the world? First, I put to the empirical truth of this. Think about the wealthiest countries in the world. They tend to be, particularly on a per capita basis, once you exclude the countries that are just rich by virtue of population, they tend to be of European descent. Secondly, these countries disproportionately benefited from colonialism. And third, I'll note that Europe is just a pretty good continent if you're going to start off right. It's got a lot of coal, its climate is very good for agriculture. The fact that it's a peninsula means you have much easier access to water, so trade is a lot easier, which means that they tend to be the wealthiest. Why is it that this keeps that wealth concentrated, and these series of deals keep the wealth that's in the hands of white European people in the hands of white European people? First, it controls where investment goes. That's why Australia sucks up the vast majority of investment in the Pacific region, because they have cultural ties to the wealthy countries that are doing that investment, like the United States. Secondly, it's about who has access to cheap goods because you're able to do the cheapest manufacturing. Third, it's about which consumer markets your businesses get access to be able to sell goods. When you get access to the biggest consumer markets, your businesses are able to grow more. And fourth, it's about who is able to be safe. Because when you have security alliances, you are able to be safe, which is a precondition for your economic development. You're able to not go through war and strife, which means that you're able to economically develop better. This weighs over the rest of the debate. The impact is enormous. We stop the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small number of people who descended from a particular area of the world. Third extension, why deals with respect to colonialism the latter post-colonial are particularly bad. I'll note, Deputy Prime Minister flags that colonialism is the cause of the misallocation, but doesn't explain why those are particularly bad deals. These were often post-colonial deals. First, I'll note empirically the number of post-colonial relationships. Second, it's a condition of pulling out. These deals were often put as a condition. And third, there's a lot of path dependency. Once this is the deal, you often don't want to change that. You don't want to go and do other things. Why are deals that are made in a post-colonial context particularly pernicious? First, often they were literally just dictated by the large country that colonized you. You had no agency. Second, even if you did have some theoretical agency, the fact that they were only going to pull out once a satisfactory deal could be found meant that you didn't have the bargaining power to do so. And third, often you signed a bad deal because you felt culturally inferior. As a result of the fact that they'd run your education system for 100 years, you felt culturally inferior, you felt like you couldn't ask for a good deal. So that's why uniquely post-colonial deals are particularly pernicious. Additionally, it allowed them to maintain other forms of neocolonialism through your relationship with them. It allowed them to continue to meddle in your politics. It allowed them to continue keeping control of your policy. Things like requiring French states to deposit half their reserves in the French treasury or having control of their foreign policy. And the reason that the trade deal or the alliance helps them do that is that you can't tell them to fuck off in other ways when you're so reliant on them through a series of alliances, because you don't want to risk that. So the fact you were so reliant on them through these alliances meant that you couldn't deal with the other sets of neo-colonial problems.
There is a single incorrect premise that underlies the entirety of the government bench, and that is that they assume that the decline of these alliances can only happen when states act with agency and go and seek greener pastures and seek out a better alliance. And that is simply not true. Alliances can decline for a huge number of reasons, including things like natural disasters, things like internal tensions, things like just the fact that the alliance is perhaps no longer that historically relevant because the Cold War's over. There are many reasons an alliance can decline, and even if that is, and that is by far the biggest harm in the debate, right? Alliances are good. It's not about trading it off as a better alliance. This is often your only avenue for things like international support and resources. Obviously, it is bad when you get poorer as a result of that alliance declining. That's going to be the extension. So firstly, I'm going to do some characterization to explain why these alliances are otherwise likely to decline, why that is relatively more common in the claims out of the government bench, give some characterization about what that looks like, and then explain a series of harms associated with that and weigh it against the rest of the round. What does this decline look like? Because no other team explains this in anywhere near sufficient detail. It looks like shunning some of your old allies or being shunned by them. It looks like weakening your ties and your trust and your institutions, things like your parliament within these organizations. It looks like diverting your resources, open investment, and attention away from these countries. It could just mean countries leave these alliances for independent reasons. And the reason that these things happen are things like, firstly, internal tensions within these alliances. Look at Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States in Central Asia, who are culturally linked, but have a historically very fraught relationship. Secondly, it's because they might be less politically relevant because of changing circumstances, because other alliances have reformed. Thirdly, it could be because of things like resource constraints, they're unable to deal with a crisis, things like a climate emergency, things like refugee crises. Or fourthly, it could just be because they don't think it is that important, it's not that, they may not just think it is that important. What that means, very importantly, is that none of these things require these nations to be replacing that alliance with another alliance, which is the central premise of the government bench. why are you not guaranteed to actually have a new alliance? And the basic premise of this is that many of the states we're talking about in these cultural alliances, as is pointed out by opening government, are often set up in post-colonial contexts, which means a lot of these countries are firstly economically quite poor and don't have a huge amount to offer other countries.
Right.
Secondly, they are often quite geographically distant. Look at Pacific Islands and the Pacific Forum, look at Central Asia and the Commonwealth of the Independent States. Thirdly, they are often quite economically specialized in ways which means they do not slot in neatly to other alliances or other parts of the global economy. And all of that, fourthly, even if you believe that these countries have something to offer, there is finite resources, and a lot of these countries are less politically relevant than other actors like ASEAN, like parts of China, to deal with things like China, if you're a Western nation, for example. And the premise underlying the entirety of international relations is that it's reciprocal. Right? OG proved governments have good incentives to get deals, but your good incentives mean fuck all if you have nothing to offer other countries. So Tuvalu, they have great incentives to get a good deal. Tuvalu can't offer anyone anything. The Pacific Forum is literally the only alliance they are ever going to be a part of. Kazakhstan is not going to get significant inflows of resources from other people trying to seek out alliances. Which means all of their harm, all of their benefits of you can seek out a better alliance is totally absurd. And that means it should be weighed very, very insignificantly in this round. Because a lot of the people, as we explained, a lot of the countries we're talking about in these cultural geopolitical alliances are relatively poor, do not have a huge number of alternatives. And I think this also responds very nicely to CG's extension about competition. That applies in a very select set of circumstances, one which we think is the minority in this debate, one which should not be credited significantly. Opening?
Yeah, competition works only if developing nations can rationally choose offers free from coercion. Why the hell would people leave this regarding that?
No, I'm not saying they would leave it. I'm saying it goes into decline. It becomes less relevant. That is independent of countries leaving it, which means you still get the harms of less economic efficiency, less interrelations between these countries. That is literally just not the case. Second harm associated with this, though, is that if you believe CG's second extension that these countries are often coerced into these alliances and they're being exploited by big players within those cultural alliances, I would note that this gets significantly worse if that alliance goes into decline and there is internal fracture within it. For the reason that if there is decline and internal distrust and infighting, powerful actors like Russia with the Commonwealth of the Independent States still have the capacity in both worlds to fuck you up, to start doing things like withholding investment, to do things like take your natural resources and mess with your border. But this decline of the alliance gives them the unique incentive to do so. Because, firstly, you are no longer as economically valuable to them because you are not as economically interlinked, so there's less mutual damage, there's less damage to them from doing so. But secondly, they have a strong incentive to deter other allies from leaving or becoming less close with Russia. So they have a strong incentive to punish you, basic game theory, tuning knows about that. So, if you believe their extension that these are exploitative relationships, that obviously gets significantly worse when you're outside an alliance, when you have no influence over their policy, when you are much more likely to aggravate them. Thirdly, even independent of that, there are other external actors which now have way more leverage over these individual countries. It's very basic mathematics. Collectively bargaining as a cultural alliance gives you significantly better ability to extract deals out of things like multinational corporations, like other alliances, do things like collective bargaining. If you are split apart, or this alliance goes into decline, and you are less inclined to bargain collectively, it becomes a race to the bottom, where it is far more likely you get forced to accept worse labour rights, worse environmental records, environmental regulations, worse profit margins on natural resources that are extracted from your country. It's hard to get good conditions on things like loans. So that is another way in which the decline of these alliances is incredibly bad for these countries. Fourthly, you just lose out on economic wealth when these alliances go into decline. You get less trade and investment. You often lose out on things that are in these alliances, like the free movement of labour, which allows far more economic specialisation and allows a huge number of people a large degree of dignity and agency over their own life. Finally, even if you believe that other alliances do exist, which is the best case that the government bench assert, you now have significantly more to offer these new people when these alliances are strong and not in decline. Because if this alliance is strong, it is more likely that you are wealthier. It is more likely that you have leverage with another actor who is the new alliance that wants to induct you is likely to value as an asset that you have, which means you have significantly more leverage and more incentive there's more incentive for these new alliances to offer you stuff if these alliances are strong and reap the benefits economically and politically. In terms of weighing that extension then, now that we've established that the government bench's premise is wrong and because decline is by far the biggest harm in the debate, I guess that's the first point of weighing. This is just the biggest harm in the debate, right? The alliances going into decline. It's not about the opening half clash about is it mutually exclusive and is NATO like Western culture, has the West fallen, etc. It is very specifically, these alliances definitely go into decline under the government bench. That leads to a series of political and economic harms which we know about, which are not contingent on very speculative and uncertain claims about alternative alliances, whether they're better. Our claim is very simply that in a lot of cases they do not exist, and even if they did, you are worse off when you have less power. But secondly, we also engage the government with Bench's central claim far more directly in a way that provides a far better response to it than opening opposition. Then we'll weigh that more further. We oppose.
The big problem with this opposition bench is they seem to both assume that cultural alliances are extremely popular. But I would observe that by the fact of the empirical reality they have declined, most countries have a revealed preference against them. So this is simply untrue. These alliances are divisive, they are stupid when they happen, they often lead to bad economic consequences, and they are unproductive for regional peace and regional interaction. The vast majority of these alliances are not in anyone's interest, and as a consequence of that, have negative ramifications with all other alliances occur, which flips both closing opposition and opening opposition. Three things I'll do. Firstly, respond to closing opposition, then opening opposition, and then I'll weigh the extension against open government. Firstly, let's respond to closing opposition. Their observation in this debate is that, well, there are countries that do not have other options. So the decline of this set of alliances excludes them from having access to any other alliance in the first instance. A few responses to this. Firstly, I would observe that every country, even countries that are small, and even countries that are poor, have things that other countries can benefit from and can access. That is things like labour, resources, collective bargaining, votes in multilateral institutions. And all of those things are beneficial even if they are small, because the level of trade that you need to do with a small country scales to the number of people that live in it. So you get the same benefit out of giving them the same level of trade, even though they're a relatively small country, and still benefit from the same things that make Tuvalu an attractive trade partner, as does Vietnam and as does other countries. The second problem with this is most of the examples they provide are examples in which these alliances would continue to form, but not based on cultural bases. For example, things like the Pacific Alliance don't occur exclusively because of cultural connections between Pacific Islanders. They occur because this is a region of the world in which they are being fucked over by other countries, being exploited, where other countries are causing things like climate change which will send them underwater, and they are interacting together in order to collectively bargain and fight them getting screwed over, which proves to you that in these instances, even where it is true that those cultural connections are what's currently forming that deal, counterfactually they would probably occur on both sides. And I note the reason why you should believe those are the most common forms of deals is because as a consequence of colonialism, wealth tends to track cultural connection, which means regions that are culturally connected tend to have similar levels of wealth. So countries in which you have that collective bargaining have the same preferences, both pragmatically and also on their cultural connection. And in instances where that isn't true, and the regional locations of countries is disparate from their cultural connection, that's examples where these types of alliances are bad and unproductive. For example, the way that the cultural connection between Australia and the United States just absorbs otherwise productive investment in the Pacific region towards Australia, where that defence could otherwise go meritocratically to where it's most productive, or where that trade could go meritocratically towards what's most productive to the United States.
Why?
But thirdly, I think these alliances are just moral alliances are much better when they're not done for cultural reasons. That is, I do not think it is a valid or justified reason to benefit another country because of its culture, even if that culture is similar to yours. Saying ethno-nationalism is good and attaching a disprivileged group to it doesn't justify that moral claim, and I don't think proves the benefit. Look, the big problem with this closing opposition is that they assume that countries don't want to get into deals with other countries just because those countries are small. But the world we live in today is more interconnected than it ever was before. Countries are vying for influence in every region of the world, and every vote in the United Nations counts equally. Every vote in those kinds of multilateral agreements is symmetric, and that influence is often extremely strategically important for counteracting larger powers like China in the example of the South China Sea, which suggests to you that it is just not true that these deals are the only thing these countries could get access to. Comparatively, they would access to deals, and we explain in our extension why the deals they would counterfactually get access to are substantially better than they were before, because now they actually have to compete based on meritocratic metrics for those deals and get better outcomes, and also you get less absorption by the global north. Next, let's respond to opening opposition. Their claim is, well, this helps you sell this to the public. Two responses. I'll explain why they're comparatively harder to sell. Firstly, the best way to sell alliances is past experience. That is, if you get screwed over because you entered into a deal with a low barrier for entry because of that cultural connection you have with that country, you get screwed over, you get worse results, which deters people from entering future deals. And that explains why comparative deals are much easier to sell because they're more pragmatically productive. But secondly, as I make as the observation in my introduction, these deals are very often extremely divisive. Look at the way the AUKUS deal has been received in Australia. It has deterred us from entering other future deals because it is stupid to enter a deal purely on the basis that we are also a white nation like the United States and like the United Kingdom. Not everyone in countries is an ethno-nationalist, and that division actually makes deals unpopular. Why is it that these deals are unpopular? Firstly, the history of colonialism is being more intensely scrutinized than previously, which means people are rejecting or are averse to entering into deals based on cultural metrics. Secondly, we are more globally interconnected than ever before, allowing people to know other people and experience other cultures more than they previously did. And thirdly, we have high levels of education, meaning people have more knowledge of cultures that are dissimilar to their own. The best evidence for this is the status quo, the revealed preference of the majority of people not to enter these deals. They say, well, it's just the elites that think this. Firstly, keeping the elites on side is pretty important. Like, if they were the ones who made the decision, keeping them in support of the deal seems like the most important thing to do. But secondly, it's untrue that only elites care about other cultures. Like, yeah, there is a connection between education and with cultural interconnectedness, but it's untrue that that tracks perfectly for all of society, and the vast majority of people in today's world, I don't think, are as racist as this thing suggests. I'll take you now.
Matt says it's bad when Spain trades with countries like Europe, because that works well. Then he says it's also bad when they trade with countries like Chile, because that's neocolonialism. Surely this demonstrates the ambiguity around things like economics. It explains why culture should be considered.
That's not a mechanism, and that also isn't a response, right? Because we're not saying that you shouldn't trade with the global south. We're saying you shouldn't trade with Chile arbitrarily over other countries in South America. Like, the fact that you were previously connected to them isn't in support of that. And we are saying that the specific fact that they were previously a colony of Spain is the reason why it perpetrates bad things in that country, but wouldn't in other contexts, which is why you shouldn't trade with either Europe or Chile. You should trade with countries that are dramatically in your interest in South America and the ones that are most deserving of it. And that flips their case, because their entire case is premised on the idea that these are easy to sell. This explains why they're divisive. Next, they say there's no trade-off. We already responded to this at Matt. There's limited amount you can trade. These deals often involve preferential treatment you can't give to everyone, and there's limited public appetite for deals, which is especially true if you believe that these are sour public opinion. They say it enhances your ability to enter other deals. Obviously, there's also flip when you prove why these are unappealing. That's where the extension against opening government, they don't really have any impacts. They say, well, this is, the majority of contribution is, well, countries are rational, and they're especially rational about serious decisions. This is an explanation about why this wasn't a mistake. They're just saying countries rarely make mistakes. This debate is about proving whether that was a good decision or a bad decision. We provide you the impacts that prove that. Vote closing government.
3, 2. I'll start by dealing with the responses that our extension gets, and we'll weigh it and explain why it beats every other team. We get two forms of responses. The first is when Charlie points out that some of the examples that we use, like, aren't enough. Well, you guys use fucking AUKUS, which is clearly not a good example for you, so you're just really, trading off number games here. But secondly, I would even point out that it ignores things like all the examples of Central Asia, and I would point out that the impact is the same. So you've just demonstrated why in one example we don't win, and we win in every other case where the impact actually accrues. The better response we get is to suggest that everyone has something to offer, so there'll be sufficient competition from other nations which will incentivize them to enter into new deals. Like 5 responses. First of all, per your characterization closing government, you explain a bunch of structural problems with the majority of these nations, which suggest why they would not be entered into the first place. First of all, you explained that often they are have an incredibly small amount of influence on the international sphere. They don't have a lot of voting power. Their resources have already been extracted and pillaged as a result of colonialism. These industries are already over-specialized to only serve the interests of the one other or two other nations that they were in agreements with. But you also explained that in many instances they are small countries with limited bargaining power that haven't developed huge productive sectors, that can't produce a huge amount of volume, which then explains why you would, in many instances, A, opt for the trading partners that you already have, because if it is true that these people had something to offer at some point and they were not trading it with other trading blocks, that would suggest that those other trading blocks would find somewhere else to get it. They would align economic development and incentives of people that are closer to them, that they have stronger political ties with, that they have been engaging with more often, such that the niche, the type of countries that you described would no longer, they'd no longer be the only person filling it, which explains why, given all the additional characterization about why these states are small, about why these states are unable to compete, then they wouldn't be preferred at all. Particularly because you, closing government, give analysis to explain why you have preferential systems within trade agreements that might include new members that threaten your ability to be competitive within them, that have the same industries as you, because you want to ensure that your trading incentives line up and you don't have to compete with the people in the same block as you, which explains why in many instances the niche that a lot of these countries are satisfying was already taken care of and was done to a better extent, which explains why there is not competition for them in many instances, which is closing government's first extension. The other thing I would point out is that their second extension, which is about the distribution of resources, is obviously contingent upon people entering into new deals, which means that the extent to which you don't believe that, like their first extension, means you can't credit their second extension, and I've now flipped their characterization, which is their third extension, to explain why that is actively harmful, why it provides a set of characterization which means you should not believe that their first extension is likely. But beyond that, no. We explain that there are still a series of short-term harms that are a result of this policy. So even if they form an alliance, closing opposition can still win, because we explain in many instances why in the short term they still suffer things like recessions. They still don't have access to important economic avenues, and that means that first of all it delays the extent to which they actually get into a new alliance, because they become increasingly unappealing at the point at which they can't take care of themselves in many instances. But secondly, it explains when they enter in those new alliances, they're often again likely to be deprioritized, they're likely not to be represented to a large extent, they're likely to have exploitative deals put on them, which means the margin of change represented by the government bench as a whole is quite small if you believe that they're a vulnerable actor that cannot negotiate particularly well for themselves, that isn't able to do things like enforce all of its own domestic policies because it's subject to the will of the only other country that was willing to trade with them in the first instance. Which describes that if you believe the margin of change is small, you ought not vote for the government bench because of the series of short to medium term harms that preclude development, that set countries back, that result in the breakdown of alliances that could have otherwise worked. Before I go on, opening.
Yeah, we support countries prioritizing their own citizens, but even if not, can't larger Pacific islands give back more to Tuvalu when they are wealthier, safer, and more diplomatically important?
Okay, the first part of what was the first part? Oh yeah, prioritizing citizens. Well, we've just explained why that's not always a cause for why it occurs, so that doesn't help you. Secondly, the extent to which this gets worse also explains why those citizens are not helped. Thirdly, they will give back in the future. Maybe, but examine that, which is speculative and uncertain, particularly because you've not been trading with these individuals, compared to what Trotter tells you, which is that now you don't have control over many of other cross-border policies that affect you. Things like how you do refugee management, things like the extent to which pollution on your borders has spillover effects, for example. Things like the extent to which you're now not willing to go to wars with those countries because of things like limited resources that are concentrated in those areas, which you are likely to want to do at the point at which you need to get a whole bunch of resources to actively market yourself because you are in an incredibly bad bargaining position. That is a harm. Let's talk about opening government, because I think closing government's kind of, well, if you believe me, they're out. So, opening government have a couple of claims. First of all, they explain that this is done well. Sam's characterization explains why the incentives of the countries is not the main factor as to whether or not a decline is likely to occur in many instances. And secondly, our extension explains why in many instances, it doesn't matter if this was intended to be done well because there is no viable alternative, which means that a lot of the other benefits that opening government attempt to reach for in the debate are out of reach. Because on their own metric, on things like development, on things like trust, on things like the ability to give back into the future, you are unable to do that at the point at which you don't have the capacity. You are unable to do that when in the short to medium term you are locked out of economic development. When political tensions within your own country rise as a result of inequality, as a result of instability, as a result of fracturing, we explain why on opening government's own metric, this is bad, you ought not support the decline. Let us now weigh our extension against opening opposition. I think the problem with opening opposition is, while they perhaps prove them, their benefits are just not important. They say that you should think of these things as cultural alliances, and they extract 3 benefits. Firstly, because there are norms of entering into new alliances. OG point out that there are other incentives to enter into norms, which explains why this is symmetric or at best very marginal. Secondly, they explain to do things like reviews of economic productivity and tourism. No explanation from opening opposition as to why you need to be an alliance to do this, for the reason that obviously you want to review your own industries and promote tourism anyway. The only other claim they have then is that you develop respect for other countries. That's probably good, but weigh it first of all against our extension, which explains why in many instances you don't just get more respect, but this will cause you to actively lose respect for a lot of countries that you're now in competition with. But the set of harms we provide are also larger on scale, intensity, likelihood, and the extent to which they accrue in the long term. So we beat OO, we win the debate.